In this lecture, we're looking at liberalism and the church. And we're doing this lecture in part because in the modern world, we're very comfortable with the conservative versus liberal splits that are part and parcel of the church, not only in the West, but around the globe. We use words like fundamentalist, progressive, liberal, and a host of others as a way of signaling the split. But I can say as a teacher of history, the more I look around the world today, the more I realize that people tend to believe, or they maybe assume, that many of these splits are a product of the 20th century. Or maybe they go back a good bit before that to the early Enlightenment itself. Well, in either of those two extremes, the history is not on their side. Simply put, the issues between conservatives and liberals, as they exist today, are historically conditioned, but they don't come so much from the 20th century itself, nor have they been percolating for hundreds and hundreds of years. Rather, what we'll see in this lecture is that a lot of the fights between liberals and conservatives get their origin from the 19th century. And we could go ahead and frame this up. There have always been disagreements over the years, over the centuries, on various issues in the church. In the Middle Ages, it was the problem of faith and reason. Obviously, flowing out of the Reformation, you have the differences between Protestants and Catholics. But you can go back even further to the debates between Catholics and the Eastern Orthodox. Within Protestantism, of course, there are a number of varied denominations and groups with different emphases. Now, at times, the differences between these groups involve the fundamentals. Catholics and Protestants, for example, disagree on the nature of salvation, and in particular on the authority of the Pope and of the Church itself. If you spent long enough and you really delve deep, you could find lots of issues of the essentials that divide Protestants and Catholics. Now, the gulf between their views may not be so great on every point, but they do differ on the essentials at times. We should highlight the fact, though, that when it comes to the vast sweep of the Church's history, you don't actually have a great deal of widespread disagreement on the essentials. You don't have lots of people thinking fundamentally different things about the incarnation or the resurrection or the cross itself. What happens, though, in the 19th century is you see arise a split, maybe just the first crack in some cases, of a widening gulf between two different versions of Christianity. Those on the one hand who would be in agreement with the orthodox principles throughout history of all types of different things, doctrines of the Trinity, of Christ being divine, of the bodily resurrection, and so on and so forth. What happens in the 19th century, though, with the rise of liberalism and some of the spasms within Western culture, is you see for the first time a widespread disagreement as to what constitutes the faith and what are the essentials that ought to be believed. This is, in other words, the first large-scale schism over the foundations of the church. Now, we need to go ahead and be very careful with our language here. When we're using the word liberal in this lecture, we're not using the more pejorative usage of that word that is often used today. At times, people are called liberals in all manner of different ways, politically, theologically, culturally, whatever. And it's often used by those on the conservative side as something of a curse word. No, the liberalism we're talking about here is liberalism with a big L, you might say. An actual movement of people within the church who wanted to refashion and reground the Christian faith in an alternative perspective and worldview, one that was more amenable to science or to logic or to social justice, and which downplayed or in some cases overthrew some of the core doctrines of the faith that had been part of the church from the beginning. And we can begin here by talking about the context. The context of the 19th century, of course, in America, which is where most of these fights begin, though of course they have all types of parallels back in Europe. The problems in America often brought to bear, and you might say intensified, some of these fundamental fights. In particular with the rise of the debates over slavery. Mark Knoll's work on this, in particular very recently, has shown, really beyond a shadow of a doubt, that the theological fights within the church, within America, drove people who were abolitionists, particularly in the North, not everybody mind, but a number of people, to begin to have concerns that a conservative, reactionary faith was the very thing that was grounding the argument for slavery. Now, as we've seen, that is often an overstatement. There were all kinds of folks who were Orthodox, conservative, we might say, Protestants, and evangelicals, who argued for abolition. Also, a number of people who argued against abolition did so on political or Enlightenment grounds. The issue of slavery, in other words, is omnipresent no matter one's worldview at this time, whether you are Christian or not. Arguments against it are, of course, omnipresent. There are people making arguments against slavery based on Enlightenment principles, and there are those who are making abolitionist arguments based on Christian principles. But the problems in America drove some to really begin to doubt that the conservative ethos of the church, based in principle in the Deep South, and the somewhat Bible-thumping way that they argued that the Bible obviously taught that slavery was just fine, pushed some to begin to seek after alternative understandings of either the Christian faith or of a moral worldview overall. In the philosophical world, there are also changes afoot that are sparking something of a utopian ideal about the progress of the Western world. Now, a lot of this is tied up with the imperialism of both Britain and the subjugation of other nations and other peoples by, frankly, the majority of the European countries whenever they landed in another part of the world. Well, the arguments that are being put forward argue in a number of different ways that the world is progressing. One of the more important examples of this is the teachings of Hegel. We can't go into Hegel's philosophy too in-depthly, but one of the more important things that Hegel talks about is the progress of the way the world works. And in particular, he's doing this in the area of epistemology and in terms of philosophy. But there are all types of crossovers to his arguments. Perhaps overly simplistic way of understanding Hegelian philosophy is that Hegel said that there's always a thesis, a principle, or a core conviction, or a reality that's out there in the world that gets matched by something that is the antithesis to that reality. And he says eventually the two of them come to a greater synthesis, a new step forward in either their understanding of philosophy or in the understanding of the culture around them. Now again, that's wildly overly simplistic about understanding Hegel's philosophy, but you can see how the layperson might have applied this. The world is progressing. We have one position, then we have the opposite position, and then eventually we come to some harmonious third option on the far side. You also have the teachings of Karl Marx, who talked about eventually the ending of capitalism. He wrapped all of human history up into the evolution of economics, and in particular he talked about the evolution from the feudal world into the capitalist society, and then eventually he predicted that all of the world would come into a socialist regime in which all things were more evenly distributed across all the levels of society. Well, there are others as well, but the tone of a lot of the philosophy and the intellectual world is bent towards this idea of progress. It's bent towards this idea of seeing human history as the unfolding of better and better successive stages, either in the intellectual world or in the social arena. Well, if you couple that idea, the more utopian expression of the evolution and the progress of the world, and you partner that up with the scientific developments and the discoveries of the 19th century, you really have a recipe for a number of people beginning to overthrow the old order of things, not just politically, but also theologically, and to embrace new things or new philosophies. And all of this, of course, comes to culmination, at least in terms of the cultural legacy, in the teachings of Darwin. Darwin in 1831, for 5 years, had gone on his trip with the HMS Beagle. He had gone and studied the natural world, and he had become convinced that some of the ideas that were already afoot, that were already being described by biologists and others about the evolution of the species, was actually a scientific fact. And so in 1859, marshaling together all these various arguments and being inspired by other intellectuals in England, Darwin published his Origin of the Species. Now again, Darwin is not the first to drop this bomb onto the European world. He is, though, the most celebrated for doing so. Darwin, in this sense, functions more like Einstein. If you look at the history of the Einsteinian revolution, of course, there is a great deal of work, just a generation or so before Einstein, a number of problems and a number of solutions that are being attempted to understand the material world, particularly at the atomic level and in terms of understanding gravity. And there were people in Einstein's day who came very close to saying some of the same things. But of course, in the history of science, it is Einstein who gets pretty much all the credit for his discoveries. Well, Darwin is a bit like that as well. There were others around him who were suggesting new things about the material world and about the history of our planet. There was, for example, Charles Lyell, a vitally important geologist who actually, in some ways, is the father of modern geology in terms of it being a hardcore science. And he argues a number of different things that he believes suggest that the world is hundreds of millions of years old. And what Lyle attacks is, in a nutshell, scientific proclamations that were being based on the Bible. Actually, in a number of his writings and his letters, Lyle is very, very concerned, and actually a bit scathing, that he wants to free science from what he calls the dispensation of Moses. And he wants to get over things like the flood or any kind of cataclysmic, catastrophic explanation of the formation of the world. And Lyle has all kinds of arguments, but again, you can see with Darwin and Lyle and a number of other scientists, they are simply upheaving so much of the established assumptions, often based on the Bible or at least based on tradition, as to how we understand the natural world. And the conversation here is not so much about Darwin, but rather the impact of the Darwinian revolution. Darwin, of course, was really describing the origins of biology. But immediately there arose a number of people who might be described as social Darwinianists. And these are people who really read the idea of the origin of the species and the competition factor that gave rise to the evolution and the mutation of various genes. Well, they see this as being involved in the social world as well. And the arguments that they make are that society is progressing, that we're leaving behind the things of old, and that we're progressing further and further into new, better established understandings of how society ought to be worked. One of the last components, though, for the shakeup of the understanding of the natural world comes about as a result of the disciplines of archaeology and historical research. As we mentioned in our lecture on the 19th century, it's often overlooked that it is in the mid-19th century when people begin to describe the discovery of bones that they eventually realize are the first fossil records related to the discovery of dinosaurs. In 1868, there's the discovery of Cro-Magnon man, one of the pieces of the argument that will become vital in the arguments about the evolution of the species. You also have a renewed interest in criticizing and applying scientific methods to the study of the scriptures themselves. And this is often called the higher critical method, sometimes called German higher critical research. Generally what's happening here, though, is you have a number of people who are treating the text of Scripture not as a sacred text, but more as a historical text. And you see arise things like form criticism, arguments that don't take at face value the purported author of individual books of the Bible. They also try to find different sources of different books. Is there potentially a source that all three of the synoptic gospels use whenever they are recounting their stories of Christ? Or are there various authors of the Pentateuch? Not Moses himself, but are there others? And there are moments where these new ideas again begin to break into the system. In 1849, Horace Bushnell wrote a very important book called The Dissertation on Language. And in this book, Bushnell argues that really you don't need to take the text of Scripture as accounting for literal truth, but rather that they are using poetic metaphor. And so things like miracles, spectacular events, or these types of things are said not to be taken as fact, but rather there is a metaphorical message within the text itself that through some hard work and labor can be discovered. Well, if that's the quick and dirty synopsis of all the changes and developments within the scientific world, within the intellectual world, and within the world of archaeology and biblical studies, what happens to the church itself? Well, simply put, from roughly 1840, going throughout the rest of the century and into the 20th century, you have really a crossroads where people decide, are they going to take the new road of scientific empiricism? Or is there some other alternative to understanding the faith in a traditional sense, but in ways that either rejects or embraces some of these new scientific principles? Now, first and foremost, those who simply say they're going to take the road of adapting the Christian faith to the new scientific understanding of the world, those who go in that direction are not initially very numerous, but they certainly have a great deal of influence. A couple of things that begin to happen in terms of those who move towards a more progressivist or liberal understanding of the church or of theology is you see a number of different ideas arise. One of the more important groups, though, are those who begin to describe social justice as the requirement of all Christians. And this is important because social justice today is a subject that's very much talked about in the church. Well, the origins of this really come in the late 1800s. A number of folks, for various reasons, begin to embrace social justice as the new model of the church's ministry. So you have men like Henry Ward Beecher, who wrote extensively on the problems of poverty and social justice. You have Walter Rauschenbusch, who lived just into the 20th century, and he worked in the area of Hell's Kitchen in New York, and he wrote a very famous book in 1907 called Christianity and Social Crisis. And Rauschenbusch's ideas that he talks about in this book and that he lives out in the context of his ministry, it really embody this decision to follow the new scientific and philosophical changes that are afoot in his century. He argues, for example, that individual salvation, evangelism, calling on the sinner to repent and come to Christ, is no longer the model of salvation that Christians should embrace. Instead, he argues that salvation comes to the collective, to society as a whole, and that it is the responsibility of the church to leaven all of society, and that society itself is being redeemed, that the collective, the group as a whole, is being redeemed when it is embracing social justice and the elevation of the poverty-stricken to new life, new opportunities, new careers, these kinds of things. And in Rauschenbusch, you see, again, this move. He ceases to care so much about issues of the Trinity or the divinity of Christ, or as the cross as being the atonement for our sins. And instead, he embraces an idea that salvation is wrapped up in social justice itself. In other words, those who go in the direction of embracing the new world, embracing these new philosophies, whether it's social Darwinianism or just simply a more or less utopian understanding of the progress of society, often a lot of these folks do so by overthrowing the old orthodoxy. Now, not every one of them does it, and not all of them do it to the extent that maybe Rauschenbusch has done here. But the idea here is that those who follow the more progressivist line seem to be teaching ideas that are different from the evangelical or the Protestant or even the historically confessional Christian model. Now, in their mind, they're overthrowing an old, worn-down, backwards way of understanding the Christian faith. And they thought, compelling reasons to do so. On the other side of that crossroads, though, those who decided not to embrace the more progressivist or the more liberal ideas that were coming into society, there really were two reactions. First and foremost, there were those who really aggressively reacted against the liberalizing of the church. And we're going to see some of this as we go through the later lectures, in particular the lecture on fundamentalism. There arose, in other words, a reaction against not so much Darwin himself, but more from where people took Darwin, from the way people began to do ministry after having given up some of the core doctrines of the faith. Fundamentalism, in other words, and some of the more aggressive anti-liberal movements within the church, both in America and in Europe, are driven by this concern that people are going to confuse the faith with mere social output, mere social work. And so there is an aggressive move by some to counteract what they believe is the liberalization of the church. Others, though, strive to remain orthodox, but they seek to find ways of incorporating a positive view of science and of the natural world that is being discovered. So evangelical Christians begin here and there to embrace a redating of the origin of the planet. And of course, they're left with lots of issues that they have to deal with. Do they believe that the flood of Noah is an actual historical event? So on and so forth. Those, in other words, that remain orthodox are not always reactionary. At times, they find themselves increasingly in this tension between the claims of science and the claims of the faith. And as the 19th century wears on, and as we get into the 20th century, those two sides on the more traditional side, on the more conservative side, will feel the pinch of the change that is brought about by all these new discoveries and changes and arguments, both in the scientific world and in the philosophical world. And so what we're going to do in the next couple lectures is we're going to look at a number of different reactions, one way or the other, back and forth between all these new changes that are coming about as a result of the modern world. We're going to see that not everyone is a fundamentalist, and that not all fundamentalists are wild-eyed, crazy nut jobs who simply are irrationally driven by their faith. Rather, what we're seeing is a cultural fight that is entangling itself with a theological fight, and that brings with it a number of questions about what does it mean to be Christian and Orthodox in the modern world.